Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Celso Amorim to our program. He is a professor and professional diplomat who served as the Minister of Foreign Relations and Defense in the governments of Itamar Franco, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and Dilma Rousseff. In 2009, David Rothkopf, a commentator of the magazine Foreign Policy, declared Ambassador Amorim the best Minister of Foreign Relations in the world. He was a founding member of the Puebla Group, which succeeded the São Paulo Forum that brings together left-wing academics and politicians in a worldwide forum. Celso, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
So let's start right into asking you a little bit about your trajectory in terms of your work as the Minister of Foreign Relations, as the Chancellor of Brazil. What would you consider the greatest achievements of the Lula-Dilma governments in terms of foreign policy?
Well, it's difficult to say in 2 or 3 words, but I would say that the integration of South America, the steps forward were very important. Our African policy also, I think I would give great importance to that. I'm stressing the points in which we differentiated more from previous governments.
Right.
And I think also these may sound negative, but the fact that we didn't succumb to the pressures in negative in negotiations that were not in our favor, like the FTAA. Well, I put that in a very simple way. Maybe if integration of South America, I would summarize with UNASUR, the strengthening of Mercosur and the creation of UNASUR, plus in Latin America and the Caribbean in a broader way, I would say the CELAC, which is the body. It's not a treaty body, but it is a forum for all Latin American and Caribbean countries. But I could add many other things. So I could add BRICS, I could add IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. Well, and I think really Brazil, I don't want to exaggerate on that, but I mean, with all the limitations of a developing country, we also came to the world scene, so to say, so that's more or less.
No, as someone teaching the history of Brazil for many, many years now, and each year kind of updating my students on what's happening, there's no question in my mind that these were very new and exciting years in Brazilian foreign policy, and really marked a significant shift, I think, in an intensification of certain areas of attention that had been previously less dealt with. And so let's talk about BRICS, for example. BRICS was an idea that was invented by a financial capital person, kind of analyzing a phenomenon of emerging countries. But Brazil was part of a process of really bringing these countries together: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa. What in your mind was the importance of BRICS as a group, and what has been its perspective since it was founded as a group?
Jim, I think it's very interesting because, of course, BRICS had been the word had been used, the acronym had been used by Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs. He didn't include South Africa, though. It was S with a small s. He didn't include South Africa. But when you read, and it caused some interest in the academic world and among economists, it was really very much to do with economy. And if you read the speech of President Lula, the 2 pages more or less that are devoted to foreign policy, you'll find it's really a program. It was almost everything done in a way or another. Of course, history changes and there were new factors. But one of them is the emphasis on a special relation with big developing countries, and they are nominated by they mentioned specifically by name the ones you mentioned: Russia, India, China, South Africa, and of course Brazil. Brazil, it was his speech. So it was in our mind that that was necessary for the balance in the world in a way. Uh, uh, we believed a lot in the multipolar world, so this was part of that vision or that view. And I think uh, the role that BRICS had, especially when the G20 was created, the BRICS precedes the G20, by the way. Not It's interesting to note that because many people think the BRICS, because the first summit of BRICS was 2009, so in a way it was after. But the forum itself started at ministerial level in 2006. In 2008, we had the first ministerial meeting outside of the headquarters of the United Nations. Before it was just a side event. So that was really before the big crisis of Lehman Brothers. There was a kind of photo opportunity with the presidents, without South Africa, in the G8+5 that took place in Japan, but really became active because of the crisis of the Lehman Brothers. And I think, if I could, it was immediately very important. And it was interesting to follow in the Financial Times, for instance, that they gave more attention to the meeting of the BRICS than to the meeting of the G7. So, because in economy, it was no longer G8, it was G7. So, and if I could mention one, it's very difficult to measure in politics, as you know, what is the effect of each specific factor. But if I could mention one factor, which certainly was a consequence of the creation of BRICS, was the change in it was a small change, but it was a step in the quota system of the IMF and the World Bank. And I think this was really given in part, of course, as a result of BRICS. But I think more than that, it also influenced the way the G20 worked and the priorities. So I think it's really it was a very important. And you know, I met Jim O'Neill some years later after I left. I later became defense minister, but after I left, I was involved in health, the question of global health. I was chairman of a small organization called UNITAID. And Jim O'Neill at the time was Minister of State for Treasury. It's a kind of vice minister in the UK. And he came, he was invited to that meeting because he was dealing with antimicrobial disease. Very interesting, but he was more interested in the economic aspect. And we sat side by side. And I said, at the time he had become Lord, but I called him Jim. And I said, oh, and he had just wrote an article some months before saying that BRICS was still a valid concept in international relations. And I said, well, you invented BRICS, didn't you? And he was very proud and said, yes. I said, but we made it. We made it.
You put it into practice.
Yeah, we put that in reality.
So BRICS has in generally been a way to organize or to reformulate a little the power relations, economic power relations in the world, bringing emergent countries or countries with very strong economies, large populations, into the international debates. But it's also a group that has very different political regimes involved. Brazil being a very, I think now a stronger democracy every day, with the recent elections and the ways in which the attempts to overturn the elections have been challenged. But Russia and China and India have very different regimes than the democratic regime of Brazil. How does that work? The economic convergence in certain ways, or interests that are shared across these countries, and real differences in political regimes?
Well, I would not say that the differences in political regimes is not an important thing. Of course it is. But this does not purport to be a group of like-minded countries. It's a group that pragmatically got together to have influence, mainly in the economy, but maybe also in other aspects of global governance. Of course, with the growth of China, now it is a bit different, but that's another question. I'm speaking still of that, what happened then. So we could have influence in other issues that might be discussed. there was some resistance to move BRICS into more political questions, but now it's very clear it's also very much present in political questions as well. And well, we were all members of the G77 plus China, so in a way, China was always a special case. So not Russia, not Russia, but the other countries, yes. So it was really more in relation to how to look for a balance in the world relations. The world could not be governed by the G7, and BRICS would be a counterweight to that. Of course, in the G20, then there we had other countries that came as well. So, but BRICS was the nucleus of this search for a balance in the discussion of international economic relations. I think it was very important in that respect. And there are differences among them. Let me tell you, if I may, just quickly, not only in different political systems, but in a sensitive question like reform of the Security Council, the position, you have two countries that are members of the permanent members of the Security Council, one that's relatively more flexible in that respect, which is Russia, and the other which is very resistant. And of course, they say it's not because of Brazil, not because of South Africa, not because of India, it's because other reasons, you know. But in any case, so there are differences. And I can mention to you, because I think it's interesting, since you are a historian, when we had the first South Africa was not yet member of BRICS, but it was getting nearer and nearer. And we had a back-to-back meetings of IPSA and BRICS in Brazil in 2010. And you may remember that at the time, Brazil was very much involved with Turkey in the discussions of the Tehran Declaration about the nuclear program. And of course, in the IPSA, we got total support. In BRICS, we could not mention the subject. So right. It's curious because Russia and China, which are very, well, how should I put, very adversarial in relation to the United States, were the two countries that create a problem there.
Interesting, very interesting. So mentioning the United States, let's jump right in and talk about a power that has had a very bumpy relationship with the United States, shall I say. In 1824, the United States was the first country to recognize independent Brazil. But on the other hand, as we know very well, in 1964, they had a very bad policy supporting the military coup and supporting the dictatorship, and took a long time to kind of withdraw themselves a little bit of that policy. And so the United States has certainly been very, very important in the world, and especially in Brazil and Latin America. And we see a very curious thing that happened in the 2022 elections in Brazil, in which already in 2021, Biden indicated that he was very much in favor of supporting the electoral process, believed in the elections, and was very concerned that there might be an attempt by the armed forces to challenge the electoral results. Joe Biden called President-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, I think 38 minutes after Alexandre de Moraes announced his victory, and congratulated him. So how do we understand this shift? And I think there are a lot of people in Brazil got confused about why a country that had been very bad in terms of its foreign policy to Brazil at certain moments was all of a sudden articulating clearly that they were against a coup.
Well, I could use the phrase of with a sentence, which is the opening words of a book I like very much called, I don't know how to call it in English, but I think it's more or less Memoirs of Zeno. It's by Italo Svevo. And it starts saying, I remember everything, I understand nothing. Right. So it's not simple question that you put. How do we understand that? Well, to start with, the United States, a very complex country. Of course, I'm saying that to you foolish even, but I do. Some people in the left or in the right in Brazil don't understand. It's a very complex country. Even the Democratic Party is a very complex composition. And I know that Trump has used and abused the concept of deep state, but to some extent that's not in the way he used, but the difficulty, I think, you take the Democratic presidents, they have great sympathy for Lula. Although I must say relations between Lula and Bush were quite correct and friendly and pragmatic, even I would say. because he was very pragmatic. We had a big disagreement in relation to Iraq, mainly, but on other respects, including Venezuela, although from different angles, we were able to cooperate somehow to have the recall referendum and so on. I don't go to the whole full story. But it's complex. The United States is a very complex country. So you may have the president calling Lula is the guy, or he's my man, whatever he says. And at the same time, you have people, some of the departments say, look, this country now discovered oil, a lot of oil. They are keeping the oil for themselves. They are getting into an alliance, which was not true because we were not getting into an alliance in any sense of the word. But people might think we're in an alliance with our adversaries, Russia and China in the BRICS, so we have to do something. And of course, they had a lot of allies in Brazil who were not happy with social justice and these things. So it's a very complex country. So we cannot speak. I always tell my friends, it's complex. When Biden was elected, people were saying it's the same thing. It's not the same thing because, in foreign policy, nuance is very important. Nuance may mean some millions of lives, or at least hundreds of thousands of lives. So if one president is threatening to bomb Venezuela, putting the Navy there and so on, and the other is, even if it's in a timid way or a shy way, it's starting at some sort of negotiation. There is a difference. And certainly, coming to your question in relation to Brazil, it was very important. It was very important because the influence of the United States has in Brazil. And we didn't ask for support for Lula, but the fact that he supported free and fair elections and especially expressed the confidence in the Brazilian voting system, that was essential. Essential not for me, maybe, or not for people like you, if you were here in Brazil, but essential for the Brazilian elite, because they look at, we are still, in that respect, we're still a very colonized country, and still have a lot. I mean, the obsession with image. I always say, image is a reflection of reality. You cannot change image if you don't change reality. During the military government, I remember I had a boss who was a diplomate, Brazilian boss, but he was a good man, and someone said, we have to change the image. And he said, well, I know a very good way to change the image. And the other person who was more conservative said, how do you do that? He said, stop torturing. Stop torturing. The image will improve. Stop destroying the Amazon forest, and the image will improve. So, but whatever the case, the importance of the United States is very big in the Brazilian elite, and of course, even beyond the elite. And that was very, very, including in the Brazilian military, who at least put them in doubt about Bolsonaro.
No, and in fact, I always say to my friends, paraphrasing something, United States is not for beginners because it really is very complex. And unfortunately, I think many people like to see the world in simplistic terms, and so it makes it hard. No, in fact, what was surprising to us is when Senator Bernie Sanders, on the Wednesday before October 2nd, presented in the Senate a resolution calling for free and fair elections and saying that the United States should cut off all economic and military aid should the military intervene. Not only I think that must have had some impact in Brazil, it certainly got a lot of coverage, but in fact, not a single Republican voted against it. And if even one advisor to one senator had called and said, we're against this resolution, it would not have passed because it's unanimous consent. And the other way to pass a resolution is very bureaucratic and very difficult and probably wouldn't have passed. So I still don't fully understand why Ted Cruz...
We owe that to your good work.
Well, I think we did hard work in the Washington, Brazil office, but I don't know that we managed to reach Ted Cruz and convince him not to say anything. I mean, there's something else going on there with a sector of the Republican Party, which is very close still to the Bolsonaro government and is dialoguing with them and wants to continue that relationship, in which they chose in this moment to remain silent. And so I think even after the election results and the mobilizations, the blocking of the highways and the going to the military barracks and calling for a federal intervention or a military intervention. The military stood by. They clearly support many of the supporters of these demonstrations, but they didn't do what they could have done to challenge the election results in a very strong way. And I think that's
and I'm very much convinced they want to, and everything will go. I can't say smoothly, because if you see the demonstrations and so on, you can't say that it's smooth. But I think there is no doubt that there are things. And I have spoken to some of them who are still in active service, and they are looking to the future. They're looking to the future. They will not say, well, we love Lula, but they are looking to the future.
So with the Constituent Assembly, the tradition that began after that was that there would always be a civilian in the Ministry of Defense. And that kind of tradition was broken in the last government. I know that the Lula administration has made a commitment to returning to that tradition, which I think is very important. What was your experience as Minister of Defense working with the armed forces that tended to be more conservative as a whole, although, of course, like every other institution, it's filled with many kinds of people with many different ideas?
First I'd like to make an observation, because you know both countries very well. Although there are incredible differences, there are many similarities between Brazil and the United States. Right. Of course, given the difference of income and so on, but in the new levels of wealth and so on. But many things are similar. And you remember that the general, when there were your general in the United States, when there were these things, the demonstrations of African
Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, he seemed to go one way, and then he changed, and he stood. I think something similar is happening in Brazil in relation to the military as well, to some extent. Not exactly, because here, of course, there was more indoctrination, and Bolsonaro was a very, very bad element, and because he exploited a lot, let's say, the personal interests and the corporative interests of the military. But I would say, taking the example of when I was Minister of Defense in Lula's government, we were able to have the Truth Commission that many consider unsatisfactory on both sides. So it was what was possible, and this was done. And if you take the words of the coordinator, because they were rotatory, but the final coordinator who was Pedro Dallari, was the son of Dalmo Dallari, and he himself a very well-known scholar and human rights activist. He said he was satisfied with the cooperation he received from the armed forces. And, when there was a special session in the Senate, in the Congress, actually, the Congress as a whole, declaring invalid the action that took away Goulart, they went there. I invited them, and they went. The four commanders, the three commanders plus the commander of the Joint Chief of Staff. So it was going, but this thing takes time. What happened? There is, of course, a strong conservative mentality within the military. Well, in a way, because they are typical middle-class people. Some come to, but very few come to become upper middle class. Most of them are typical middle class. So all these people are very much liable to those accusations of corruption and all that. Well, I work here and so on, and still now it's different. But anyway, there was this reason. But I think that most of all, and of course, they were brought in by the economic elite and the big media. Of course, there was a role in the military. That's clearly, above all, in the case of Dilma, it was above all guaranteeing, quote unquote, that the process would go. So that was their role. But you cannot say it was a military coup. It was a coup that started in the media. It started in the Congress. It started by very clear. It was supported by the media, by the economic elite, and then the military came somehow. In the case of because it's all let us say, a kind of slow motion coup. So when it came to Lula, there was a more evident role because it was the tweet, the famous message given in the internet by Vilas Boas. So that was a more clear intervention, of course. But even that, to a large extent, was arranged. It was immediately put in the main Jornal Nacional, the main news in Brazil. So I think he was then with Bolsonaro. It was different because so it was something that was growing, but we didn't know how far it would go. The influence of the military. But with Bolsonaro, it was different because he was, in a way, able to convince most of them to be part of his government, to benefit from his government. I think and of course, then the ideology also came back. I'm not saying that, but it was not a typical. Bolsonaro is much more a figure like the fascist period in Europe, and to some extent Trump. And of course, he was very clever in the way he used the military. But when I talk to some of them, including some that are now already retired, but are no longer part of the government, they are very critical of Bolsonaro. They are still very conservative, if you wish. They're very middle class. The message is all we have to have honesty, we have to combat corruption, which is okay. I'm all in favor of honesty and combating corruption, but not in favor of coup d'etat. So, but I think that they were they became very critical of Bolsonaro as well. So I think it's important to study the military, but it's probably more important to study the social phenomenon that allowed Bolsonaro, social, including the manipulation, but not only the manipulation, that allowed Bolsonaro to have 49% of the vote in the second round. This is something that historians, maybe you, who are near spiritually, but at the same time with a distance, could study that deeply, because for me, it's still difficult to explain.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the same situation in the United States, where a majority of the Congress people in the Republican Party who were elected still believe that Trump won the election. And there's a hardcore within the Republican Party, which was reflected in his vote, that support a far right agenda. So it's a very concerning thing for all of us who believe in democracy and social justice. It's not a situation only of Trump in the United States or Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's a worldwide phenomenon that we're having to confront. I wanted to follow up on one thing about the Truth Commission and then comment and ask a question about what you just said. Some people analyzed that the fact that the Truth Commission insisted on certain questions, that it kind of provoked the military into direct opposition to the Dilma Rousseff government and to kind of passively or aggressively support the parliamentary coup that took place in 2016. How do you understand that? Do you think that the Truth Commission, which has a very good final report calling for the end to the amnesty law of 79 and other questions, do you think that was a factor in mobilizing opposition to the government of Dilma Rousseff?
Well, let me say one thing. First, maybe the Truth Commission should have happened much before. So when the country democratized, because that's when all the memory was alive on both sides. 20 years later, say, well, why that? Why create that problem now? So, that's one point. And the other point, again, as I said, you made a proviso because it says passively or actively. I think it was more passively than actively. Maybe they were applauding on the backstage, but they were not. They were not the conductors. It was Eduardo Cunha. It was you know the process very well. So I don't think that was crucial. Maybe it was crucial if you take the long term, the slow motion thing that culminates with Bolsonaro's election. Well, I think it may have been a factor, not specifically one, but I don't think that it would have been that way if the politicians and the other parts of the elite had acted in a different way. It's very curious because, in a way, I was the defense minister during the whole period of the Truth Commission. It was very tough time. I would like to devote my time to other things like the programs, the technology and so on, and I had to devote a great part to the Truth Commission. And certainly it was an irritating factor. When you talk to the people of the high-ranking people, what we call the high command, I don't know how to call that in English, the high command, they would normally say, well, let us forget. They would not defend what they did in the past, you know. So it was more that kind. We do with one or two exceptions. People even when there were reactions for the people who were already in the retired. In Brazil, we call it reserva. When they were retired, one of my most immediate collaborators was the chief of staff. Said, "Oh, don't mind what they say. They are always like that. They are so." I think that could have gone if the politics had gone in a different way. But I think it takes many years to change the mentality. Many years. Some said, well, some tried to justify the coup d'etat of 64, saying that was the Cold War, the two sides, blah, 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 blah. But many tried to avoid the question and be more technical. So I don't know if I replied to your question, but before replying precisely your question, I want to say one thing, which I think is important, because I compare the United States and Brazil, but there is one thing which I think which makes a difference is because, of course, the military in the United States are mainly concerned, not totally, but are mainly concerned with foreign wars, with external wars. And in Brazil, as a consequence of a good thing that we have been peaceful, we don't have a war, they devote a lot of attention to the internal security. So, with their conception, of course, of internal security. So that explains a little bit the different attitudes.
So, when Pedro I dismissed the Constituent Assembly in 1823, I'm going to try not to be an annoying historian, but then the Constitution of 1824 gave him the moderating power, that fourth area beyond the legislative, judicial, and the executive. Even though that doesn't exist as a term in the Constitution that was established after the Republic, there's been a tradition in Brazil of intervening in politics in a very intense way. How does a new government, with all the challenges that the new government is going to face economically, socially, this divided country, how does it slowly get the military to understand that the poder moderador, the moderating power, doesn't exist legally? It's not in Article 142 of the Constitution.
It's
something that's right, exactly. But yet there's a strong tradition. One could even argue that it was, I argue that it was the Duque de Caxias, who eventually became the Minister of War, in his early days of consolidating the empire in repressing regional revolts throughout the country. He was very important in all of them, throughout the country and much of his career. And then the tradition of the military intervening in politics in the 20th century, which is pretty dramatic. How does a new government find a pathway towards really separating the military from engagement in politics?
But Jim, let me insist on a point. I think we were going in the right direction. That would take a long time. It would need a long time. The coup was not a military coup. It was a coup by the Brazilian elite with support of external forces that you know. But it was so then, of course, opportunistically, they came back and they became, but it was not a military coup. Of course, there is an ideology. I don't want to deny that. But they had stopped celebrating, at least officially, the coup d'etat of 64. So things were going, you know. And if I would take here this famous saying by La Rochefoucauld, that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. So, and with time it becomes an accepted truth, you know. So I think it's more a problem of a social thing of the Brazilian economic elite, because it's very, very curious. Because you take, I'm quoting two examples. For instance, when I was in the Ministry of Defense, journalists I wouldn't say, well, even taking O Globo, asked forgiveness for what they have done in 64, because they have supported the coup. One of their main journalists, Miriam Leitão, interviewed me from the point of view of human rights. I always had a good relation with her, but very aggressively, because I was the Minister of Defense, and she thought maybe that the Commission of Truth should go deeper or things like that, in which maybe she was right. I'm not saying that she was wrong, but that was the position. Then, of course, there is a coup d'etat with the characteristics that we mentioned, and they support in the beginning, because until the Temer government was there, they were all supportive of the coup. Then with the Temer somehow, and then Bolsonaro, it was different. But anyway, so I think it's really, what do I say that? Because I don't think I'm not diminishing the problem, especially now in this transition period, but I don't think we should be concerned with the military, we should be concerned with the doctrines, we should be concerned with all that, but we should be more concerned with society, and we should be more concerned with the fact that the Brazilian elite, whenever it's in trouble, they call for the military. They call for the military. The military don't come alone. The military came in 64 because they had been called by the Brazilian elite and they have been called by the United States of America. Now, I think it's a difference. I always say that there are three factors that were behind every military coup, apart from the military themselves. Three forces. The Brazilian economic elite, the Brazilian big media, to some extent is very linked to the other, but anyway, Brazilian media, and the United States of America. And now they wouldn't have the support of the three of them. So that's why I think it will receive. How it changes, it takes time. My relations with the people of the High Command was a very pragmatic one. The people in the Navy were interested in having, of course, if you ask their political opinion, they would give a more conservative one. But they were concerned with the submarine of nuclear power, the other, even in the army, one of the guys who was chief of staff, very important guy, very important post, he quoted, Brazil literature as well. He quoted Graciliano Ramos in his speech. Graciliano Ramos was the card carrier of the Communist Party in Brazil.
Right.
So things were changing slowly, But the coup against Dilma, which didn't start as a military coup, became a military. All of them went to when the Gulags, I don't know how to call that in English, but
what's the word in Portuguese?
Huh?
What's the word in Portuguese?
Restos mortais.
When his wow, how do you say that? His mortal, I don't know. It's his body.
It's not easy. I'm glad that you're there.
I don't know how to translate that myself.
His mortal remains, so to say. When his the remains of his body came back to Brazil, because they had gone abroad for a study, they all were there, received with martial, with formal. So, these things seem superficial, but with time things would change. But they were called back and they found it good. They found it that it was they would have a lot of power, and so on.
So you mentioned just briefly the importance of the United States and all of these actions in Brazil. So what will be the relationship of the new government to the United States, and how does that fit into a multipolar world in which China is a very, very strong competitor of the United States in the global scene?
Well, I always say that we have a lot to learn from the United States. There are many positive things. In a way, even what happened in January 6th there somehow was helped us to prevent it, what happened here. Speaking of the places where I worked, you had 2 or 3 women who were Secretary of State. We didn't have a president, though. But anyway, you have 3 or 4 women in the bureaucracy and all that, ambassadors to the UN, so much before us, even in the military as well. So I think there are many good things, even, let us say, gay rights and all that in the United States. So I think we have a lot to learn from some good aspects of the United States. and we have interest in having good economic relations and political relations, but we don't want to believe, we don't want to take sides in a new Cold War. So one of the happiest moments for me recently when I heard Biden saying this is not a new Cold War. And I hope he goes on because I think one mistake, whatever you think of the regime in China, don't want to say, or whatever you think of Russia, this is not, cannot be a crusade. The crusade crusade was war. So we don't want wars, even if they are, there's not the good against the bad, that won't work. So we want, if the United States has this kind of understanding, also in relation to Latin America, South America, they're able to do some gestures towards negotiation in Venezuela. I'm not saying that they should support Maduro, I'm not saying, but support negotiations. If sanctions against Cuba are progressive, like Obama has started, I think that will help the region. So that's something that maybe sometimes in the United States is not perceived. Is that although even at the time that most of governments in Latin America were conservative, when you are very interventionist against Cuba, everyone reacts because they don't like it. So I think, and I think the Biden administration is slowly learning that. I think in the way they recognize quickly Boric and Petro, and of course in relation to Brazil, Brazil is a special case in a way, but I'm mentioning the other two who were fighting against, let us say, normal right-wingers, especially Petro. So I think that's very positive. So that shows that there is I think we'll have good relations. We can cooperate on questions of green development. What the United States should do. I had a very good relation with the Republican was Bob Zoellick, because he was an intelligent man. He was very tough in negotiation. Sometimes he could be brutal. He was never brutal with me, but I saw him being brutal with people of much richer countries. He could be brutal in negotiation, but he was very intelligent. And he said, Celso, you have the habit of giving advice to the United States. And I said, well, yes, of course, because it's so important for us. But I think it's very difficult for the United, why did I mention Bob Zoellick? I forgot my reasoning. But anyway, it's very difficult, the situation in our continent, very difficult, because you have one superpower. And it will always be difficult to accept that you'll have not another superpower, because I don't think Brazil will be a superpower, at least in military terms, but another big power. It's difficult. It's difficult to accept. And it is ambivalent. I had agreements with Condoleezza Rice, trilateral agreements in relation to Africa, in relation to the Caribbean. Maybe because she saw that as counterbalancing the Chinese interests. I don't know what was in her mind, but we had, at the same time, we disagreed on many other subjects. But I think we can have this pragmatic relation, but it cannot be the kind of whoever is not with us is against us. Right. So anyway, that's it.
So UNASUR, the Union of the Countries of South America, is an important force. We have a situation in which a series of left-wing or progressive governments have come to power in South America. What is your analysis of the new balance of power in this regard, in terms of progressive governments in South America and the United States in the immediate future?
Well, Jim, I think if there is understanding, as there was Obama when he was president, and he came to the first summit of the Americas that happened after he was president, he asked for a meeting with UNASUR. So when I listened to UNASUR and people here in Brazil saying that it was a Bolivarian, it was not Bolivarian. The biggest contribution Chavez gave to UNASUR was the name. The name. Maybe the energy behind that also. But very often it was an object. For instance, we had to discuss the question of Venezuela and Colombia and the bases in Colombia, and we found solutions that were accepted by both sides. So we're pluralistic. So I want to say, of course, I'm glad when I see other progressive governments in the region, but we will have to deal with the countries in the region, not if they are fascist like Bolsonaro, because that's a different situation. But if some of them are more conservative, Well, we have to deal with that. It's their question. We cannot solve. We won't intervene in Venezuela, as people some would like, but we won't intervene. We did not intervene in Colombia either at the time of Uribe. Actually, so it is pluralistic, but it strengthens the region geopolitically. And I think it gives the opportunity even for dialogues that are impossible. Why did Obama ask for a meeting of UNASUR? Because he saw a possibility of dialoguing with those that he would not dialogue normally. Venezuela, Ecuador at the time. So I think UNASUR is, of course, very important for us, but I think it's useful even for the United States in terms of helping the dialogue. And then there is I wrote a book, which you certainly have not read, but you should, by the way, because you're a historian.
It's immediately on my list of things to do.
Yes, because it's very historic, because it's very much based on my notes at the time that things happened and things that I discovered later. When there was a crisis in Bolivia, almost verging on civil war, someone asked, well, this happened several times, but in one of them, when it was still the Bush government, someone asked Condoleezza Rice, but Bolivia, what are you going to do with Bolivia? No, Bolivia is for Argentina and Brazil. So
let them solve the problem.
Let them solve the problem. So in a way.
So what is the path forward for Brazil, which aspired to be a member of the Security Council after World War II, after having participated with the Allied forces in World War II in the Italian front, and have been blocked out, and when you have the 5 veto members of the Security Council, what is Brazil's path forward in articulating a restructuring of these world bodies? You've mentioned that in recent interviews, that this is something that is a challenge for the country. What's the path forward for that? Because it seems to be a very difficult thing to reorganize the world order that was established after World War II, and is a very different situation from the current one.
Yes, but it's more difficult not to reorganize, because we're seeing how the world is becoming a mess. We are not able to deal with the climate. There is a war in the very heart of the heartland, to allow me of the geopolitical heartland in the world. And it was not only an aspiration of Brazil in the Second World War, it was also an idea of Roosevelt. And that's in the memoirs of, I forgot his name now, the guy who was the foreign minister, or foreign secretary, the head of the State Department during most of the period of the war. I forgot his name. It will come back in a moment.
I'm going to take a risk because I don't really know U.S. history as well as I know Brazilian history. Was it Morgenthau?
No. It was the one with a very British name. Anyway, but it doesn't matter. In his memoirs, 2 volumes of memoirs, I even gave an example to Cardoso to give to Clinton at the time. He said that Roosevelt supported Brazil for a permanent member. Then with all the politics, of course, and there were 2 oppositions, really. Russia, Soviet Union, because they thought Brazil would be an American ally, and England, because Churchill thought they should put more weight on the European. And if you had another American, it's an interesting thing. And in the end, the United States, paradoxes of history and ironies of history. The United States wanted very much China, which was nationalist China. And now they have China there, as they want. So they gave up Brazil in favor of China. So anyway, but now the world is different. I'll take the words of, in a way, which I heard in a seminar the other day of a U.S. researcher, Anne-Marie Slaughter, she's well known. And she says, how can we imagine the world in, I think it's more or less what we thought. How can we imagine the world of 45 being organized along the precepts of the Congress of Vienna? She didn't mention the Congress of Vienna, but so how can we imagine 80 years after the Second World War having the same kind of governance? It's impossible. So I have been ambassador to the UN, I've been ambassador to Geneva, so I have seen these things happening. It's not theoretical. So you have a big problem, whatever it is, you take to the Security Council. And in the Security Council, if the powers are not in agreement, nothing happens. So nothing happens with important questions. So, or what happens, or happens in violation of the Charter of the UN, which is, again, very bad. For instance, like the invasion of Ukraine, but also like the invasion of Iraq and the bombing of Kosovo and so on. I mean, maybe the motivations are different, but anyway, strict in terms of law, it's the same thing, the violation of the principle of integrity of states and so on. So, what I think, may I risk now? What I think, it's very difficult to reform the United Nations. But in a way the world started the reform with the creation of G20. Only crises bring reform. Of course, it's not institutionally linked to the UN, and that may be one of the problems that we have to solve. Not institutionally linked to the World Bank, so what they decide doesn't immediately become law for them. But it is strong. It has strong political. So maybe if you take the G20, make it a little more African and a little less European, maybe. You have, and maybe with one or another touch, you start having a body that can have a big inspirational power, I think. And if you have a consensus there, the P5 are there, everyone is there, so you have a basis to go on. So I think the form of global governance, which include climate governance, which include the governance for global health and so on, poverty, inequality, and so on, should be from the G20 somehow. That's not doing away with the United Nations, because the United Nations is the legal body, the other is not. But that may give the inspiration to change. It's not easy to change. I know it's not easy. But I start seeing, even in the United States, maybe it was because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I don't know, some movement from the even the Biden, I think, when he spoke at the event, he said that there needs some, but more in a more specific way by the ambassador. I forgot her name now. Anyway, U.S. ambassador. So I think this is urgent, and this has to happen if the world wants to survive. If you want to avoid war, if you want to avoid the climate catastrophe, you have to have new global governance, and the reform of the Security Council will be part of it, instead of dealing with it alone.
So about the war in the Ukraine, what will be Brazil's response to the war in the new government? What will be the new government's policy towards Ukraine?
Well, we don't have doubt that Russia was wrong to invade Ukraine. I have to say that. I also think that geopolitically, it's not wise to ever expand NATO, but this is a judgment of a different kind. But I think we'll be looking into the future and to the urgency of having peace negotiations. And Brazil, if we can help by giving some alternative voice to other countries, I think that would be the...
I can't help but ask this final question. Do you think you will be the new Minister of Foreign Relations?
I don't think so. I think I have done enough in this. Well, if Lula asked, of course, but I don't think so. Yeah, if I have a room in the back part of the palace, and if he calls me from time to time to have a cup of coffee, once or twice a week would be okay. I will be very happy.
Wonderful. Celso, I want to thank you so much for this amazing interview. I could go on for hours. I have many questions. I know many people who study foreign relations are going to be annoyed with me that I didn't ask you more questions to see if we can learn more about what's going to happen. Thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered.
It was a pleasure, Jim. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoy the interview. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.